All right. So, you know how we always talk about getting those like aha moments, those ideas that kind of shift how you see things?
Yeah, totally.
Well, today, I think we might have one of those because we're diving into this commentary from the Journal of Medical Education. And it really gets you thinking about like the very core of what it means to be a doctor,
Hmm. Interesting.
not just like individually, but as a whole profession,
Yeah.
you know?
Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean.
And it's written by these three folks, Robert Sternszus, Linda Snell, and Salim Razack. And let me tell you, they are asking some really thought-provoking questions.
I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So basically, their central point is that all these calls, we're hearing more and more about, for doctors to be anti-oppressive, anti-racist, to really understand cultural safety and social justice. Those aren't just like nice add-ons.
Right, right.
They're saying these calls actually point to a much bigger need to like re-examine the entire identity of the medical profession itself.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
Oh, it is. And they even say it pretty bluntly, like, who physicians currently are as a collective is not who they ought to be.
Okay, who they ought to be. That's a huge statement. So where do they go from there? Why do they think this reevaluation is so urgent right now?
Well, from what I'm gathering, a big part of it comes down to this whole idea of health equity.
Okay, yeah,
The idea that everyone deserves a fair shot at being healthy.
absolutely.
And the authors are pointing out that for a long time, and even still today, people from marginalized communities, they haven't had that fair shot. They've actually experienced a lot of harm within healthcare systems.
Yeah, that's unfortunately very true. And it makes you wonder, if we're talking about changing the very identity of the medical profession, how do we even go about deciding what that new identity should be?
Right. And the authors actually bring that up themselves.
Oh, they do?
They talk about the whole issue of power dynamics and who gets to decide what doctors ought to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important point.
And they remind us that even the way we've set up medical regulations in education, historically, it's actually contributed to those inequalities, even if it wasn't intentional. It's like baked into the system.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So are they suggesting specific changes or more like a process for figuring it out?
Well, they bring up this other study, actually in the same journal by Percival and some other folks.
Okay.
And this study looked at how medical students from minority backgrounds experienced remediation.
Remediation.
Yeah. When students need extra support to meet the requirements.
Ah, got it. So what did they find?
Well, what's really interesting is that these students often felt like their identities actually made them more likely to be put through remediation.
That's pretty concerning. It makes you think about whether the standards themselves could be biased somehow.
Exactly. And it gets even deeper than that.
Yeah.
They also found that these students tended to view remediation a lot more negatively than their peers
Oh, why is that?
because they felt like it was rooted in something called epistemic injustice.
Epistemic injustice. Okay, now I have to ask, what is that?
So epistemic injustice is basically like when someone's knowledge and experiences are dismissed or devalued because of who they are.
Oh, I see. So these students felt like their perspectives weren't being taken seriously simply because of their background.
Right. And that their understanding of things, their lived experiences, were being seen as less valid.
Wow, that's really powerful. And kind of heartbreaking, to be honest.
It is. And it really highlights that whole question of who gets to define what's considered right or normal in medicine.
So how do we start to address this? The authors mentioned something about identity safety, right?
They do.
Yeah.
And that's another important concept that's been explored by folks like Bullock and others.
Fill me in.
Well, it's all about creating a learning environment where students feel safe to bring their whole selves,
Mm-hmm.
without feeling like they'll be judged or that they have to constantly self-monitor and hide parts of who they are.
Right. I mean, if you're constantly worried about fitting in, it's got to be hard to really learn and grow.
Totally. But here's where it gets even more nuanced. The authors point out that while creating identity safety within a program is super important, it's not the whole solution.
Oh, interesting. So what's the other piece of the puzzle?
It's not just about making individual programs more inclusive. It's about looking at those professional norms themselves, the ones that apply to the entire profession.
Okay, so their argument is that we need to change the standards, not just how we teach them.
Exactly. And their commentary is basically offering a roadmap for how to do that. They're proposing a process for re-examining those core norms that define what it means to be a physician.
I'm really curious to hear more about this process. How do they envision it working?
Well, they emphasize that it needs to be inclusive. Like, we need to bring diverse voices to the table to shape what those fundamental attributes of a doctor should be.
Makes sense. It can't just be the same people who have always held power define what it means to be a good doctor.
Right, and the goal isn't to create new forms of exclusion, but to help doctors better serve all of society.
I like that. So we're talking about professional identity, but how is it that these identities actually form in the first place? I mean, every doctor is their own person, but there must be some shared understanding of what it means to be a physician, right?
Oh, absolutely. While each individual doctor's identity is unique and influenced by tons of factors, there are definitely some core elements, some shared values and expectations that are traditionally linked to the profession.
Like what?
Well, think about things like, a commitment to patient well-being
Hmm.
or upholding ethical standards. Those are pretty central, right?
Yeah, for sure. But everyone brings their own personal experiences to the table, too. How does that fit in?
Right, and that's a key point the authors make. As people go through medical training, they bring all their own personal values and experiences, which are shaped by their backgrounds, their race, gender, culture, all of that.
Mm.
And the commentary highlights that if someone's experienced discrimination based on any of those parts of their identity, it can create real tension as they try to fit into that professional mold.
Yeah, I can imagine. If you've been told you don't belong or you're not good enough because of who you are, it's got to be tough to then try and conform to a professional identity that might feel like it excludes you.
Absolutely. And that's where this idea of professional identity formation, or PIF, comes in.
PIF.
Yeah, it's basically the process of learners being socialized into the profession.
Okay, so learning how to be a doctor, not just the medical stuff.
Exactly. They're figuring out the norms and expectations at all these different levels.
Yeah, what do you mean?
Well, there's the broad societal understanding of what a doctor is. Then there's the specific culture of their chosen specialty in their university, and even just the day-to-day stuff within their department or program.
So many layers.
Right. And the authors are pointing out that these norms, they're not fixed. They're actually influenced both by the medical profession and by broader social values.
It's all connected. And they talk about the social contract too, right?
Exactly. That idea that there's this agreement between the profession and the public, this trust that doctors will use their knowledge and power responsibly for the good of everyone.
And that's where things get tricky if the profession's norms and values don't actually reflect the diversity of the society they're serving.
Right, like if the standards for what makes a good doctor are based on the experiences of a dominant group, it's going to be harder for folks from different backgrounds to feel like they belong and to be seen as competent and trustworthy.
Okay, so this PIF thing, it's not just about learning the medical stuff. It's about navigating those power structures and social hierarchies too.
Exactly. And the authors bring up the fact that we've seen efforts in medical education to address some of this,
Oh, yeah. Like what?
with things like trying to recruit a more diverse student body and including stuff about cultural competency in the curriculum.
Right, right. But it sounds like the authors are saying those efforts haven't gone far enough.
That's their argument. They say these steps are good, but they haven't really led to those core norms being transformed.
So learners from underrepresented backgrounds, they still often feel like outsiders and values like social justice haven't become like a central part of the profession's identity.
Exactly. And that's why they're pushing for this deeper re-examination of the norms themselves.
Okay, so let's get into that. If we're going to re-examine these core norms, where do we even start? They keep mentioning this epistemic humility thing. What's that all about?
So that's a key part of their whole approach. It's about recognizing that the way we've always done things isn't necessarily the only way or even the best way.
Okay, so being open to the idea that we might need to change.
Right. And that the knowledge and power structures that have shaped those norms might not be as objective or neutral as we thought.
Humility, like acknowledging that we don't have all the answers. I like that.
And they suggest a really interesting way to approach this whole process of categorizing the norms.
Ooh, how so?
They talk about these non-negotiable core norms,
Mm-hmm.
the ones that are absolutely essential for patient safety and ethical practice.
Okay, give me some examples.
Things like honesty in medical records, respecting patient autonomy, getting informed consent. Those are like the bedrock of the doctor-patient relationship, right?
Yeah, those seem pretty fundamental, but are they saying everything is non-negotiable?
No, not at all. They contrast those with norms that are way more dependent on the context.
I'm listening.
And this is where they ask some really interesting questions, like, what does it actually mean to be appropriately dressed as a physician.
Right. Like who gets to decide that?
Exactly. Or what are considered appropriate boundaries in the doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah, those can be really subjective depending on the culture and the individual people involved.
And their point is, are those things truly about making sure patients are safe and getting good care, or are they more about enforcing conformity to a specific cultural norm?
That's a really good question.
And the authors are arguing that any norms that are actually causing harm or that contribute to injustice, those need to be thrown out.
Makes sense. But what about the ones that are more subjective, more culturally influenced? What do they say about those?
Well, their take is that those shouldn't be seen as like rigid rules, but more as opportunities for reflection and learning, both for individual doctors and for the whole profession.
Okay, so instead of being punished for not conforming to a certain norm, there's space to talk about it and understand different perspectives.
Right. And they're saying it's not just about scrutinizing the norms we already have, it's also about figuring out what's missing.
Like, what are we not doing that we should be doing?
Exactly. What fundamental principles aren't currently part of the professional identity that are actually essential for protecting the public?
That's a good question. Are they saying there are things missing?
Well, they ask this really direct question, and it's pretty powerful. They say, can physicians protect the public without a commitment to social justice? In the absence of a commitment to anti-racist practices, can we say that our profession serves and protects the interests of all of those to which we provide care equitably?
Wow, that's a tough one.
It is. And their answer is pretty clear. They say, no, medicine can't truly fulfill its purpose without addressing those broader societal issues.
Okay, so if this whole reexamination thing is so important, what does it actually look like moving forward?
Well, their big thing is that the entire profession needs to embrace this epistemic humility and engage in a critical review of both the norms and the power structures that created them.
Okay, but who's actually going to do this work?
Well, they really emphasize the role of medical education institutions and organizations at all levels.
Okay, so from the groups that grant licenses to specialty societies to individual training programs.
Exactly. They're saying these groups need to actively commit to this process of re-examining those norms, and it needs to be reflected in everything they do.
So not just talking the talk, but walking the walk.
Exactly. From their mission statements to how they train new doctors to the actual content they're teaching, it needs to be a real shift in the culture of medicine.
And this can't just be doctors talking amongst themselves, right? The authors talk about partnership, too.
Oh, absolutely. They're very clear that this reevaluation needs to involve patients, community members, and especially those who've been historically marginalized or underrepresented within healthcare.
Because they're the ones who have the most direct experience with the ways those norms can play out in real life.
Exactly. Their perspectives are crucial in shaping a more just and equitable profession.
So it's not just about the outcome, it's about how we get there.
Right. It's about the process itself being inclusive and collaborative. And the authors end with this really important warning.
Uh-oh, what's that?
They say, if we don't do this, if we don't engage in this critical reexamination, there's a real risk that the whole idea of professionalism in medicine could be misused, even weaponized.
Yikes. That's a scary thought.
It is. And they're saying that without this shift, those systems of regulation and remediation, they'll just keep reinforcing those inequalities and that epistemic injustice we talked about.
And ultimately, doctors won't actually become who they ought to be, right?
That's their point. So for you, listener, the takeaway here is pretty huge. The medical profession is at this point where it's being called to really look inward,
To examine those foundational beliefs and practices and make sure they're actually contributing to fairness and justice in healthcare, not unintentionally upholding systems that cause harm.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how this idea could apply beyond just medicine, right?
Ooh, I like where you're going with this.
Like how might other professions or even just our broader societal norms benefit from this kind of critical self-reflection?
Yeah, especially when we think about diverse perspectives and that goal of achieving more equitable outcomes for everyone. What assumptions might we be holding on to that are worth questioning?
It's a lot to ponder for sure. We encourage you to sit with these ideas and maybe explore how these concepts of equity and professional norms play out in your own areas of interest. There's always value in taking a critical look at what we consider normal or expected.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Hope it's given you some new things to think about.
Thanks for joining us.
See ya next time.